Well, welcome everyone. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our special guest today, theologian and author Brian McLaren, my friend. And I'm hoping Brian will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 45 minutes of questions and conversation. You can find many other wonderful upcoming Zoom programs and podcasts at beatitudecenter.org, and we'll send out the Zoom recording link in a few days. So let's begin with a little prayer, as we always do. I invite everybody just to take a deep breath and relax and center yourself and notice how you're feeling as we begin some time together in reflection with our friend here and teacher. And I invite you into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely, personally, unconditionally, and the whole human race. And let's welcome the risen, nonviolent Jesus here into our circle and take a moment to ask for whatever graces and blessings we need to follow the nonviolent Jesus more faithfully. Beloved God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect on your call to follow the nonviolent Jesus. Bless us, disarm us, heal us, inspire us, enlighten us, and strengthen us to go forward that we might do what we can to help end violence, war, poverty, injustice, authoritarianism, white supremacy, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction. That we might always do your will and be your holy beatitude people, that we might be who you created us to be, your holy peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters. We ask this mighty blessing in the name of the nonviolent Jesus. Amen. So welcome again, everyone, and I'm glad to spend time together. Here we are in May 2025. With the collapse of democracy in the world, it seems, and the rise of Christian nationalism and authoritarianism, oligarchy, white supremacy, fascism here at home under the Trump administration, the Republican Party, and Fox News. Meanwhile, ongoing permanent warfare, the Israeli genocide in Gaza, the nuclear threat, catastrophic climate change. And we're all struggling how to respond, how to live, how to be faithful and peaceful in this time. And I think the best way to do that is always to look to the nonviolent Jesus and to see what he did and to try to do the same as his disciples and followers. And we have a great teacher with us to help us to do that today. And so I'm delighted to introduce you to my friend, the scholar, theologian, best-selling author Brian McLaren, who's going to reflect with us on Jesus and authoritarianism then and now. Brian spent 24 years as a pastor in a local congregation in Washington, D.C., and his life and ministry were changed when, as a young evangelical pastor, he realized, as he writes, that he was called one day to be a follower of Jesus, not a follower of the Bible or a theological system or hierarchy. So for the last 25 years, he describes himself as trying to take Jesus public, which is what I'm trying to do too, Brian. And Brian is the Dean of Faculty for the Center for Action and Contemplation, which was founded by Richard Rohr, and offers the podcast Learning How to See and co-hosts Southern Lights. His many best-selling books, which I encourage you to get, such as Do I Stay Christian, Faith After Doubt, Finding Our Way, Everything Must Change, A New Kind of Christianity, and Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad cross the road? Brian is a very popular speaker at conferences and is just heading off on the road as usual. He's been in all the media, as some of you heard me say, including Larry King Live, All Things Considered, Nightline, On Being. He's married to Grace. They have 4 adult children, 5 grandchildren, and please check out his website, which is brianmclaren.net. So, dear friends, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest and teacher and friend today, Brian McLaren. Brian, you're very
Thanks.
welcome here. You're among
Thanks,
friends.
John.
The floor is yours.
Well, I appreciate it, John. So good to see all of you. And I just want to say how grateful I am to you, John. Really, you have been an example and a mentor from afar, and someone I've just kept track of through the years. And you've inspired me so much. So I'm very honored to be here with you, John, and with all of you who would take some time on a Saturday to talk about Jesus and authoritarianism. And I'm going to kind of flip it. I'm going to talk about authoritarianism first. A quick story. Some years ago, I did a deep dive into movement theory. I wanted to understand how movements work. And I just, I'm a kind of a nerd at heart, and I just researched movement theory. And when I looked at Jesus in light of movement theory, I felt like I saw Jesus in a whole new light. Like I already was a sold out Jesus oriented person, but my admiration and sense of, oh, now I understand what Jesus is more about, it just skyrocketed through that study. And in 2016, I started a similar study of authoritarianism. And I feel like the more I have learned about authoritarianism, it has also increased my love and respect and a sense of coherence and understanding about Jesus. Uh, and obviously, by way of contrast, but I hope the same thing will be true for you. And so I'd like to talk about authoritarianism a little bit with you to start. First, I want to say authoritarianism has been the backdrop of human civilization for thousands of years. Um, uh, um, Whenever we use the word civilization, we're usually talking about authoritarian systems. Um, it's only in more recent centuries that we have had counter authoritarian movements that created new political structures like democracy to put the limits on authoritarian leaders because people experience both benefits from authoritarianism and great costs. Some people experience great benefits, other people experience great costs. And so by way of background, I want to say that this struggle with authoritarianism feels new for people about my age and younger. But even my parents and grandparents, in a sense, they grew up in a world where authoritarianism was in the headlines every day, whether it was in World War I or World War II. John, you and I and others in our age group, we grew up learning about Pol Pot in Cambodia and a number of other authoritarian leaders who had quick rises and quick falls. But I think we never thought that we would have to be dealing with the issue of authoritarianism on our own streets and in our own headlines. For me, in 2016, I started thinking something is up. It was January of that year where there was an election, we'll remember. And I watched as one candidate after another who was running against Donald Trump, who would say that he was unfit, that he was not well mentally, that his ideas were harmful, that he wasn't a true conservative, all the things they would say. As soon as they were out of the running, they would bow the knee to him. And he had insulted them, insulted their spouses, insulted their parents. He mocked them. He had names for them. And watching this flip where people would go from being opponents to then being totally submissive, I just remember thinking, there's normal kind of craven politics, but this is at a new level, and there's something going on. So I have a couple friends who are psychologists, social psychologists, clinical psychologists, and I contacted them and I said, look, anything you read that you think will help me understand what's going on here, please send it to me. But I'm trusting you, stuff that's peer reviewed, stuff that's empirically based. I don't just want political commentary. I really want stuff that you think will help me understand on a more with a more critical and scientific eye, not just a partisan eye. So that began my research, and it continues to this very day. I just feel like we're getting a crash course in authoritarianism day by day. I want to read you, just to give you an idea that this is not a new problem. I want to read you a couple of paragraphs from Thomas Aquinas. And probably, John, you read way more Thomas Aquinas than you ever wanted to in your life, in your upbringing. But this is from Thomas Aquinas, uh, and speaking about the issue of authoritarianism using the language of his day. He says, the disregard for the common good is greater under an oligarchy than a democracy. That you'd think he's writing in 2025, but he's writing in the 13th century. Greater in an oligarchy than under a democracy. But worst of all is a tyranny where the advantage of one man is sought. The rule of the tyrant is worst. Security is banished, and everything is uncertain when people are cut off from law and depend on the will, I would even say the greed of another. The tyrant oppresses the bodies of his subjects, but what is more damnable, he threatens their spiritual growth, for uh, he is set on his own power, not their progress. He is suspicious of any dignity that they may possess that will prejudice his own iniquitous domination. That phrase, skeptical of any dignity they may possess, quite striking. And this next sentence, a tyrant is more fearful of a good person than of a bad person, for he dreads their strange virtue. There's something that goes on in the mind of a tyrant, he's saying, where they don't understand what we would call virtue, courage, compassion, kindness, self restraint, mutual respect. These virtues seem so strange that the tyrant is afraid of them and sees them as a threat to him. Fearful lest they grow strong and so stout of heart as no longer to brook his wicked despotism, but resolve in companionship to enjoy the fruits of peace, a tyrant is constrained to destroy good people's confidence in one another, lest they gather together to throw off his yoke. Therefore, he sows discord among them and encourages dissensions and litigation. Now, that comes from the 13th century. And I'm about to give you a kind of a short summary of my research on authoritarianism, but I don't think I'm going to say anything that wasn't pointed at or touched on in what Thomas Aquinas said these many centuries ago. This is not a new problem, but we live in a time when democratic structures to limit the power of authoritarians were developed over many, many centuries. And we had grown accustomed to thinking that the kind of tyranny that Aquinas talks about, or what we're calling authoritarianism, was either a thing of the past or a thing of less developed countries and democracies. And we're having to have, among many other wake-up calls, we're having to have a wake-up call to understand that authoritarianism is a far deeper problem. The real study of authoritarianism took off after World War II for obvious reasons. People thought of Germany as the most intellectually advanced country in the world, the country where rationalism had its deepest roots. And to watch Germany in World War II go under the power of an authoritarian leader and regime, it shook everybody up. And after World War II, there was a wave of research in authoritarianism. I remember I first heard about it when I was in college. I was born in 1956, so just 11 years after World War II ended. And 18 years later, when I was a freshman in college, I heard about the Milgram experiment. Some of you may have heard about the Milgram experiment. It was an experiment done by a psychologist at Yale who was trying to understand authoritarianism. And I'll just give you a brief overview of the experiment, but you could look it up and read about it. It was very controversial, but it involved bringing in people from Connecticut around Yale and telling them that they were part of an experiment in education. And they were going to be reading a subject, reading to someone a series of questions, and if the person got the wrong answer, they would administer a very small electric shock. And then if the person would get a second wrong answer, the shock would go up a little more. And a third, it would go up a little more. Well, what they didn't know is that the people they were testing were actually part of the experiment and they were the ones being tested. They thought they were testing someone else. They were being tested. And what they found is that people that they'd keep having to raise the voltage that people were being shocked. And these were normal people off the street. And what they found is people would, the subjects would were actors and they would say, ow, ow, ow. And then eventually they would just go silent as if maybe they were unconscious because these people were pressing the button. And what they found is that normal people would comply with the instructions they were given by a scientist in a white coat with a clipboard who had the air of authority. And as long as they were being told by someone they gave authority to, they would keep upping the voltage. Of course, it was all imaginary. It wasn't really happening. And so that experiment was, I remember the first time I heard of people really researching people's susceptibility to authoritarianism. Another fellow around this time, a Canadian social psychologist named Bob Altemeyer, he really became one of the leaders in studying authoritarianism. And he and other social psychologists came up with a term, super important, I think, in my understanding of authoritarianism today. The term was authoritarian personality. And the authoritarian personality wasn't someone who was likely to become an authoritarian. The authoritarian personality was someone who would be the first to happily submit to an authoritarian. And what they found in their research is that if you keep raising stress levels among people, raising them a little higher, a little higher, a little higher, stress, shame, fear, raise their stress level high enough, hunger, thirst, that people that certain people, a predictable proportion of people would say, put somebody in charge to take care of this. In other words, there were a group of people who were so sensitive to stress that they wanted a strong man or a powerful person to solve the problems at any cost. And what they found in their research was that about 30% of people in this country, in this country, in this country, they started to find that anywhere they went, when they developed this indicator of the authoritarian personality, about 30%, 30 to 33% of people tested as authoritarian personalities. Now, this doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that their wiring is such that they're the first to respond and be willing to submit to an authoritarian leader. There's all kinds of, as you can imagine, this is very controversial. And then they deepened their research in the 1960s and 1970s, and they specified looking at what they called right-wing authoritarians and left-wing authoritarians because they had people to study in both movements in the 60s and 70s. It's much harder to find left-wing authoritarians today, but back in the 60s and 70s, there's a number of places they could go. And what they found, and I'm simplifying a lot of research here, but I think this is a fair representation of it. They found that right-wing authoritarians work primarily on fear. They work on the fear of a real or imagined enemy. And what right-wing authoritarian leaders do is they create or find or identify or focus on an enemy to make you afraid. And that fear is then what makes people look to the authoritarian leader to be the one who will say, I alone can fix it. I can build the wall to keep the people out. I can do whatever needs to be done. I even hate to use this language, but think of World War II. I have a final solution for the problem of those people. And this right-wing authoritarianism, so many examples of it through history. And by the way, we'll come back to this, but the Christian religion has played a key role in authoritarian movements through its whole history. and has been very often the most willing pawns available to to take up a righteous hatred of the people identified as the enemy, or the threat. So there's been a strong right-wing authoritarianism. Left-wing authoritarians generally work based on making promises. They say the system is corrupt and I promise I will fix it. Now, this makes left-wing authoritarianism more vulnerable because you can gain power by making big promises, but if you don't fulfill the promises, people become disillusioned with you. And what they found in many cases is that left-wing authoritarians gain power by making promises of how they'll fix things, but when they either can't or won't fix things as promised, and won't bring you benefits as promised, you'll make more money, you'll have better health care, you'll won't be so hungry. When their promises aren't fulfilled, the leaders often then become right-wing authoritarians because they shift from making promises to identifying an enemy to blame, who that then excuses them for not delivering on their promises. So you can see that sort of left and right wings, in some ways, the straight line becomes a circle, in many ways. Um, so let me give you a simple definition of authoritarianism, to bring it all together. Here it is. Authoritarianism is a way of centralizing power in one person, one party, one ideology, one cabal. Cabal is a useful word. For right now, let's just call it a group, but I'll come back to it in a little while. Centralizing power in one person, one group, one party, one cabal, using four primary techniques: fear of a threat, fear of the other, division of a society based on loyalty to the regime and opposition to the identified other. Third, distortion or distraction from the truth. And fourth, suppression of dissent. And once you have that definition, I'll just tell you a whole lot of things start to make sense. Um, Not only when you look at current authoritarians, but when you look back through history. Uh, Fear of a dangerous enemy or threat, real or imagined. One of the top contemporary scholars of authoritarianism is a woman named Sarah Kendzior. She did her PhD dissertation while she lived in Uzbekistan under an authoritarian regime that arose there after the fall of the Soviet Union. And she chronicles in her dissertation how the government of Uzbekistan created a dangerous enemy who didn't even exist. It was a total fabrication, that they made people so afraid of, that the people were willing to cede more and more power to the regime. And I'll just tell you, an interesting example of this in recent years was Antifa. I don't know if you all remember when Fox News and a number of politicians were constantly talking about Antifa. I was in Charlottesville in 2017 as part of the clergy counter protest or counter demonstration to all that happened there. I was just up the street when Heather Heyer was killed by vehicular manslaughter, a vehicular murder. And it was a day I will never forget. My nervous system can sort of start ringing with the memories of that day. But I can tell you, I met quite a few people affiliated with Antifa. And I actually was privileged to be able to see the communications that Antifa was involved with. And first of all, there are very few people affiliated with Antifa. There were then, and there aren't many now. We're talking about a couple of hundred people. And second, they're not this big threat, right? But if you watched Fox News and heard a lot of people talking for a couple of years, this was the manufactured threat. So fear based on an enemy, real or imagined. Second, division of society. If you don't join us in being against these people who are the dangerous enemy, then you're now an enemy. You're on the side of the regime. I'm sorry, you're on the side of the opponents and the threats to the regime. So fear, division, and these aren't byproducts. These are the products to create the conditions through which the authoritarian rule can really thrive. Um, so division of society is not a mistake. It is a desire of an authoritarian regime. Third, distortion and distraction from the truth. Now, a critical technique of this, an informant unwittingly let out this method, how you distort and distract from the truth. Someone you probably have heard of named Steve Bannon talked about, I won't give an exact quote of what he said, but he said you have to flood the zone with misinformation. Hannah Arendt, the great chronicler of 20, early 20th century authoritarianism, said the goal of the authoritarian is to confuse you with so many lies. The authoritarian will tell you 10 lies that contradict each other because the authoritarian is not trying to make you believe him. The authoritarian is trying to make you feel you cannot believe anybody and you can't believe yourself and your own critical thinking. And by the way, that's one of the things Thomas Aquinas said. You won't trust your companions. You won't trust anybody. And in the absence of anybody you can trust, you stop caring whether the authoritarian is telling the truth. You only care whether he can have power and control. And you want him to have power and control because you don't know anything else that will save you. And you can't think for yourself. You don't know what to think. And then fourth, suppression of dissent, being opposed to the free press, being opposed to anyone who tries to tell the truth, and dissent from the actions and falsehoods of the regime. And so that is your basic primer on authoritarianism. Let me add a couple of additional thoughts here, and then I want to move to talk about Jesus. There's a whole lot we haven't covered, and I'll be glad to answer your questions in a few minutes. But first, let me say something about the role of religion in authoritarian movements. I want you to imagine that something like 30% of people, when they're under stress, feel more comfortable when there is a very powerful, commanding leader in the room or in their mental space. And then I want you to imagine that in democracies, we tend to inhibit dominating leaders. Dominating leaders tend to be weeded out of a lot of bureaucratic activities. It's one of the purposes of a bureaucracy. And we might complain about bureaucracies for being slow moving and so on, but you understand they're intentionally slow moving so that they can inhibit authoritarians from taking over. Now, we might say, well, hold it, it's gone too far. Now, even good leaders can't lead. Well, this is one of those things in life, we've got to be able to hold a both and, that there's a strength and a weakness, and there's a yin and a yang to all of these things. But imagine that a democracy happens and 30% of people are kind of wishing there was a strong man around to make them feel secure. And then imagine that creates a certain market. It creates a certain unmet psychological need. And then imagine how religious leaders could move in to meet that need. Those of you who are Catholic, you can imagine how, in the bureaucracy of Catholicism, that in some ways suppresses heroes from arising, and extraordinary people. They all tend to be homogenized. Wear the same, keep everybody in the official uniform. But if people are looking, something's missing in their life, they wish they had a strong leader. You could imagine how in Catholic history, certain people would be able to arise and draw and they would provide that authoritarian voice that people are looking for. They would have the appropriate anger. They would be angry at some enemy other, and they would be happy to divide the Catholic Church in order to gain more of that power for themselves. And they would distort and distract from the truth, and they would suppress dissent. You can imagine that would happen. But and of course, Protestantism, we could debate to what a degree Martin Luther himself was an authoritarian leader. I'll just tell you, as a Protestant, lifelong Protestant, I like him a lot better before he had power. When he was crusading against the abuses of power, he was one kind of person. When he got a lot of power himself, you watched a lot of that change, right? But Protestantism has been a seedbed for authoritarian leaders, and in a certain sense, it has. I'm what I'm saying now could sound very unfair. I'm not saying this is true of everybody, but I'll tell you as a Protestant informant, okay? There are an awful lot of Protestant churches where the leader is an authoritarian and the people love it. It's why they're there. It meets a psychological need for them. So I want you to imagine in a society where you have freedom of religion, you have a lot of people who can create, who draw all the authoritarian followers to themselves. And then can you see how if an authoritarian leader, political leader, were to make deals with those religious leaders would have a lot to gain by bringing their people to the authoritarian leader who is very transactional and will give them power as long as they comply. You can start to see where there's this powerful relationship between authoritarian leaders and religious leaders. You can see Catholic versions, Protestant versions. You can see Muslim versions and Jewish versions, Buddhist versions. It's all around. And of course, there are atheist versions of it too, where atheism itself becomes a kind of ideology that draws people together to very dominant personalities. Okay, enough on authoritarianism. Let me talk about Jesus. If you were to try to imagine, if you were to take what we've just talked about, and I encourage you to do this, read through one of the Gospels with just this simple introduction to authoritarianism, I predict that you will start to notice things you haven't noticed before. For example, Jesus shows up. Well, actually, let's start with Mary. His mother is famous for a prayer we call the Magnificat, in which she praises God because God has noticed the lowly estate of this poor peasant woman, Mary says. God has noticed me. And then she explains her dream that the rich will be sent away hungry and the poor will be filled with good things. Now, we might think, gosh, it's not very charitable for the rich to be sent away hungry. But just take this language as the language of a person who's being oppressed by authoritarian systems and structures and is saying the only hope for people like us at the bottom is that those powerful people at the top will be scattered, that they'll lose their unity, they'll lose their power, they'll lose their advantage. How do they get that advantage? Through violence. And in the history of what we call civilization, the concentration of violence among the elites in power and wealth creates the backdrop into which Jesus comes, where there's an authoritarian structure called the Roman Empire. Some of the Roman emperors were more authoritarian, some were less, but they operated by the same playbook. And violence was the main method of creating fear. And by the way, fear of the enemy and then fear of the authoritarian leader. If you don't join him in your fear of the enemy, then now you're afraid of him and his power. And Jesus comes on the scene, and what is his message? Rethink everything, everyone. Rethink all of your assumptions. Everything you've been taught to think has been shaped by authoritarian structures. Your assumptions about what matters and how power works and how people should get along, how we relate to the earth, how we relate to people of different nations and religions. Everything you've been taught has been shaped by authoritarian structure. The kingdom or empire or authority structure of God is at hand. The alternative civilization, the alternative empire, the alternative way of distributing power, the alternative arrangement, the alternative social structure, the alternative social system, the alternative ecosystem, the alternative world, meaning a worldview of human beings, is at hand. It's within reach. It will require you to rethink everything, to become like a little child, to be born again, and start to learn a different logic. Um, uh, Jesus uh, goes around speaking in parables. Well, why would he speak in parables? Well, let me offer two reasons. First, because when you live in an authoritarian regime, you can't always express yourself freely. Look, the things we're saying right now in this Zoom conversation, we don't know if somebody's listening in on this call, but it's not hard for us to imagine 1 or 2 or 3 years from now where we might be afraid uh, to even be on a call like this because our name would show up and somebody's keeping track of those names. I was just on a call with campus ministers the other day, and around the country, different campus ministers were saying that they're putting up surveillance cameras in all the main places where there's protests, and they're passing rules to say that no one can come to a protest with a mask on. And so you just and what these campus ministers said is that this is sending a chill through people. So what happens when the authoritarian clamps down on free speech and says you can't protest and you can't speak against the regime? Then people become silent. And when they become silent, they feel complicit. And when they feel complicit, they now, in a sense, Tim Snyder calls it preemptive surrender to the authoritarian regime. And so what people do is they find ways to tell the truth. They find ways to speak the truth indirectly rather than directly. In Emily Dickinson's words, they tell the truth, but they tell it slant. And one way to understand parables are ways of giving social critique. They're ways of proposing alternative values through an art form, a short work of fiction, to try to get people, to open people's imagination to think beyond a zone that has been flooded with BS by an authoritarian regime so that people can find a little space to think differently. That's one reason I think Jesus speaks in parables. And another reason is because he is trying to draw people out from their conscious mind that has been so shaped by the economics and politics of the authoritarian system so that they can start to exercise their imagination. Things like empathy. How would I feel if I were that character in that story? How would I feel if I were that character in that story? How would I feel if I were that farmer or that king or that subject or that steward? And the act of empathy, you may have noticed in recent weeks people speaking out against empathy because empathy involves you using your imagination to enter into the experience of another. No wonder Jesus speaks in parables. He knows what he's doing. He's in an authoritarian regime. He's not afraid of being killed when the time comes. He knows, at some point he must understand that's going to happen. And he even tells Peter that according to a couple of the Gospels. But he doesn't want to be killed until he does the work he's trying to do and models and teaches a message of non-authoritarianism, of non-violence, a different way of relating. Um, Two more things I'll say about Jesus. What's Jesus most known for? Well, he's known for traveling from place to place and healing people and feeding people. He does miracles of healing and feeding. What do authoritarians do? Authoritarians kill, torture, threaten with they threaten people with violence. They take life as opposed to giving life and health. Um, and they starve people. Uh, Now, I know it might sound crazy to talk about an authoritarian regime that was set up trade wars with other people, but you understand restricting trade is a wonderful way of managing the flow of goods and services. And when you have control of the flow of goods and services, you can make people very desperate and very afraid. Get the 30%, first 30% activated so that then they mobilize the others to say, we're happy to have a strong man lead us. It's better than being under this economic strain. So Jesus' actions of healings and and feedings themselves are an anti-authoritarian move. Um, by the way, authoritarians like to suppress dissent. So what does Jesus do? He takes people out in the country where they won't be under so much surveillance, and he talks to them. He teaches them. He gives them free education, uh, and he tries to help them learn how to think on their own, right? Oh my goodness, suddenly you start to see what a masterful movement leader Jesus was, an anti-authoritarian movement leader. One more dimension of Jesus' teaching that, look, what I'm about to say is controversial, and I won't be offended at all. I won't be offended if you disagree with anything I say, but what I'm about to say will be very different from what you may have heard before. But I think apocalyptic literature has been misinterpreted by the Christian religion. We have tended, I think, to teach that when Jesus or Daniel or other biblical writers and speakers talk about apocalypse, we've thought they were talking about the end of the world, and we've put it off in the future at some point in the future. I've more and more come to believe that apocalyptic literature is not about the end of the world. It's about the end of this world, meaning this world arrangement, this world system, this authoritarian regime. And I become convinced that the eschatological horizon, the view of the end of the world that Jesus was talking about, was the system that was currently oppressing the Jewish people. And um, and they I don't think had any conception of the end of a space-time universe. But what they did have is the idea that this way of life that's humiliating us and oppressing us and exploiting us, it can't go on forever. And so in that light, the weirdest thing about Jesus' teachings for most people today is his apocalyptic messages. Instead of seeing that him talking about the end of the world, I think what he's saying is he's saying to people, remember what he said? He who endures to the end will be saved. And when Jesus says saved, I don't think he's talking about go to heaven as opposed to go to hell. He who endures to the end will be liberated. That this system will come to an end. It's not going to be easy. And here's what, to me, one of the most fascinating things. He says there's going to be war, there's going to be rumor of war, there's going to be all kinds of trouble. He says this isn't the end. These are just the labor pains. Now, what are labor pains? Labor pains are what happen to give birth to something new. And so at the core of Jesus' teaching is the idea that if this current system crumbles and fails, then on the other side, something new can be born. Um, Maybe that's a good place for me to stop because we'll have a lot more fun asking questions and having conversation about this. But I hope you have a feel. I hope, if nothing else, I can just convey my sense that when you understand authoritarianism and you understand that violence that has been so key to John's incredible work through the years, exposing the myth of violence and exposing the the false promises of violence. When you realize that violence is the 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 tool of authoritarians, suddenly you understand how nonviolence and peace and anti-authoritarianism have an awful lot in common. So let me stop there. And where would we like to go?
Well, first of all, thank you. Gosh, Brian, that was overwhelming. And on behalf of everybody, thanks for sharing. I just want to say, are you sure you don't have a little bit more you want to talk about Jesus? No, seriously. If you
Yeah.
wanted to go 5 or 10 more minutes
Okay.
about
I
Jesus,
will.
I'm gonna presume permission in a nonviolent, non-authoritarian way. And because I think there was more you wanted to say, and we need to hear it. And
Okay.
folks, I really want you to invite you to put questions for Brian in the chat. That would be helpful. But you said Jesus is radically anti-authoritarianism, and you got up so far to the parables. Keep going a little bit
Okay.
long.
Okay. Let me share two additional things. First, let me talk about Jesus' relationship to the outdoors. And second, let me talk about Jesus' relationship to money. Um, One of the things that's striking about Jesus, some of you may have read, I wrote a book last year called Life After Doom, and it's about what people are calling the polycrisis, which is the there it is. It's the intersection of uh, ecological overshoot, when we suck more from the earth than the earth can replenish, and we pump out more waste into the earth than the earth can detoxify. When that happens, every generation passes on to the next generation a more impoverished and unhealthy earth, right? And we've been in that process for a long time, and we're now at a critical moment. So the polycrisis involves that, but it also involves authoritarianism, concentration of wealth and power among a smaller and smaller group of global elites. And it involves things like white supremacy, religious supremacy, the mass production of weapons and increasing weapons of increasing kill power that John has taught us so much about the necessity for us to not just let this keep going under the zone that's been flooded with distractions. Realize that this is of vital importance to every living thing. Um, uh, but Jesus uh, comes on the scene, and he keeps going out in the country, starts his starts his ministry with a 40-day vision quest, evoking what indigenous people around the world do. Part of their entry into adulthood is go through a rite of passage where they go out and go alone. What happens when you go out into the wilderness? Well, internet connections weren't that good in Jesus' day, but there were other ways that authoritarians got their message out. They'd have the inscription of Caesar on walls. They'd have statues of Caesar everywhere. They'd have Caesar's name on every coin. The news was all government propaganda, filtered through government propaganda. And so when you go out in the wilderness, one of the things you're doing is you're saying, I want to get my head away from all of this human system. I don't want to be under the the flooding of the zone with authoritarian propaganda. I want to go out where I'll hear the birds and I'll hear the wind. I want to go out where I'll be exposed to a logic that is billions of years older than the logic of human authoritarian regimes. I want to get in touch with more ancient primal logic and beauty and wisdom. Uh, and so Jesus goes out in the wilderness. And then all through his ministry, he gets up before dawn. He's getting away from people, recentering himself in a different logic, the logic of creation, the logic that people who spend all their lives in heated and air conditioned buildings, looking at screens, surrounded by the logic of man made architecture, the scale of man made architecture. Uh, they don't understand. I feel so sorry for Donald Trump and all these people that he's giving so much power to, in the sense that, these poor people have probably never experienced the wilderness. And if they did, they just saw it as what a waste of space. We could put up a resort here and make $1 million. We could cut down all these trees and have a great golf course. Real estate exists in their minds to be developed, but the earth exists to tell the glory of the Lord. I was reading Psalm 104 the other day. What an incredible psalm. And it says, want you to know how much I've learned from John. One of the things that I've learned from John of the many things is I just love to read the Psalms and put the name of the Lord as the God of peace. But the God of peace clothes is clothed with light. I just love that. Wherever light goes, you're you're seeing the clothing of the divine, of the God of peace, of the Spirit of peace. And the whole earth is full of divine glory. So that's just one thing there. You understand, we need some leverage point outside of the systems of this world to begin to understand a different set of values. Silence, solitude, outside of human structures. And of course, in Christian history, you have the desert fathers and mothers. It's no accident that the Buddha has his great enlightenment not sitting in a temple or in a palace, but sitting under a tree. It's no secret. It's no wonder that Muhammad has an understanding of a God who's bigger than the tribal gods who are inciting greed and violence among his peers when he goes out in the wilderness in a cave. It's no wonder that Saint Francis was found wandering out in the countryside and in the forest and paying attention to the birds. So that's the first thing I want to say. Jesus embodies that. He exemplifies that. And I tried to write about that in a couple of chapters of this book, Life After Doom. And then second thing I'll just say something is about money. Um, when you think that money is the currency of the empire, and the empire is the structure of authoritarianism, when you put that together, you start to understand why Jesus hated money so much. Like we think, well, it's really an overstatement. I mean, think about Jesus saying this. You will either love God and hate money or love money and hate God. No one can serve two masters. I mean, that's a staggeringly radical statement. Um, and I think a lot of people just say, oh, he was being naive or oh, he was using hyperbole. But when you look at it in this light and you think what authoritarianism is closely related to money, I don't think there have been any altruistic authoritarians. You find out that financial corruption goes with them wherever they go. And one of their main ways of controlling people is through the weapon of money, withholding money to some, rewarding others with money. And when you look at money as not so much a measure of value, but as a measure of distribution of power, um, then you look at Jesus' teaching on money and you see why he is so suspicious of it. He's not against using it. You know, the story about Peter finding the coin in the fish's mouth. Yeah, go pay your taxes, go pay the taxes. But the whole thing is dismissive. And this reminder, render to Caesar that petty little money. The money is part of the authoritarian regime, and render unto God what is God's, which is everything, ultimately. And and maybe that's a good place for me to close by saying this. When we start seeing it in this way, the grandeur of Jesus' core message of the kingdom of God, the empire of God, the structure of God is so wonderful and great that instead of thinking about how do we live out the kingdom of God inside of this authoritarian structure, we start to think, what is this dirty, dingy ghetto of human civilization doing in this beautiful world and system of God? And it starts to make us imagine things that we couldn't imagine before. Um, and oh well, I hope that let's see where the questions go from there.
Well, thank you. I want to push you one more thing. So
Yeah,
you've brilliantly laid out authoritarianism,
yeah,
and you've talked about Jesus. In particular, you talked about he says you got to rethink everything. He used parables. He was healing, feeding. He was one with nature and the outdoors, and he rejected money. Therefore, I know this is silly, but tell us as clearly and concretely and simply as you can, what are some things we can do
Yes.
as followers of Jesus in the era of Trump? And Trump has his finger on the nuclear weapons, and we're in catastrophic climate change, and there's potential of death for
Yeah.
hundreds of millions of people, really.
Yeah.
So we can do those things, and I could just list them again for you. But Brian, just maybe list them. I want to write them down and
Yeah.
think on it. What,
Yeah.
how do we follow Jesus's anti-authoritarianism today?
Yeah. Yeah. So, thanks for that, John. The first thing that comes to my mind is a quote from Audre Lorde, who was a Black feminist, essayist and writer and novelist, just a brilliant human. And late in Audre Lorde's life, she had cancer, and she wrote something about cancer that, as someone surviving with cancer, that related so closely with what she wrote about politics. And
Mm.
she said, the aggressor, meaning cancer, has to kill in order to succeed. The resistor has only to survive. And you could have thought she was speaking about politics. She said that about cancer, but I think the two resonate. So the first thing I'd say is, for us to survive with a different value system intact is a very, very significant thing. Um, because systems come and go, civilizations come and go. And one of the things you get the feeling Jesus is interested in doing, and in many ways it seems to me he models by his own death, is by saying that my physical life will come to an end, but my spirit will live on. And I am sowing my life as a seed to be a seed of nonviolence that will outlast the violent systems, the violent regimes of this day. And so the first thing I'd say, and I don't mean this trivially, I mean this with the deepest seriousness and sincerity, is every day that we survive, keeping an alternative value system alive, that is a victory in an authoritarian time. Uh, that's not all, but that's without that we don't have we don't have a lot, right? We have to survive with our spirit intact, and that's one of the other things about authoritarianism is that, well, here's how Nietzsche said it, who was a strange character because in one way he seemed infatuated with a certain kind of authoritarianism because he'd lost some sense of moral coherence. And of course, with Nietzsche, it's so complicated because of mental illness and other things. But he said, beware in fighting the monster, lest you become the monster. And so one of the things that's very easy is to become the mirror image of the thing we're trying to fight. I hate those people who are so hateful, right? It happens to all of us. And so that's part of what I mean by survival. Second thing I would say is we build communities where it is safe to think differently. It is almost impossible for a person to keep their bearings on their own in the face of authoritarianism. Um, and uh, we need communities. That's why for all of us, it's worth our time to be together on a Saturday, to be with some other people who are thinking differently.
Mhm.
And I don't know what's going to happen with our churches. It feels like so many of our churches have surrendered, at least partially, to the current authoritarian regime. But as time goes on, more and more churches will have to make a choice of what it means to be in resistance and to understand ourselves as a counter-authoritarian movement, which is another way of saying a movement of equality and dignity and mutual respect, a community of justice and peace. And so suddenly our churches become more meaningful, they become more important. And if our churches sell out, as if more and more of them sell out, it will mean that gatherings of two or three will be the place where we feel Jesus, the Spirit of Jesus, present with us to keep living in this alternative way. And I personally think that's another reason why gathering together in the Spirit of Jesus to open our minds and hearts to Jesus' teaching and Jesus, and the stories of Jesus and the life of Jesus and the people who and the stories of the people who follow Jesus through history becomes so deeply important. Um, there's probably more that should be said. And John, if you have anything you'd like to add, I'd love to hear what you'd add. But let me stop there.
It's just great. It's just all helpful. And well, I'm thinking, I mean, what you already said, and I wrote down a lot of notes from your talk, but so therefore also we don't want to be afraid. We're going to non-cooperate with the rising fear. We are not going to name others as enemies, and therefore we're going to have universal love and welcome everyone.
Yeah.
In a culture where you're telling us they're going to be flooding misinformation and lies as normal, we're going to speak truth and seek truth like never before. Jesus taught us.
Yeah.
Of course, oneness with creation, all your beautiful teachings about Jesus's practice, more than ever, that's the first response to climate change, to become one
Yeah.
with creation again. And I think rejecting money like never before has to be a lot more conscious among all of us in this first world. Maybe we need to go and do some miracles and start feeding the hungry and healing the sick and sending the rich away empty. And those are good starters. Brian, let me go to Kathy. Do you want to, Catherine Crosby, my friend, why don't you unmute and go ahead and ask Brian your question yourself? And is that Judith Traeger you've got a question? I'll let you ask him as well. It's not Judith Traeger, it's the other Judy. Okay, then I'll call on you, Judy. So go ahead, Kathy.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. So
Thanks, Kathy.
you, when you framed Jesus' parables as subversive, I mean, I've heard that word subversive before, of course, about the parables, but then you framed them as evading detection, like so intentional. That added a little element to it. So that reminds us of the power of story.
Yeah.
And so often in families, in communities, we remember, we share the stories of the past. Future's kind of murky, especially with AI and so many things coming
Yeah.
down the pike. So it's like now to keep that hope and that love that John just talked about alive, like what are the stories that we tell that will appeal across the spectrum? So
Mhm.
not just our Christian scriptures, but as I know from your work, you know well that we're all in this together, Christians,
Yeah.
Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, et cetera, et cetera. Where are those common stories?
Yeah. Yeah. What a good question, Catherine. Um, First, let me say something about that common connection. Um, I mean, I can't help but think of this because I see John's face on the screen here, but I'm just thinking, John, how you through the years lifted up Gandhi and and
Mhm.
and talked about Gandhi as one of your teachers. For us as Christians to those of us who are Christians to be very quick to praise and celebrate the leaders of other faiths who are leaning in this same direction in their own context, right? Um, and and I think there's this sort of double thing that we have to do. We have to tell our stories. Like my Jewish and Muslim and atheist and Buddhist friends really like to hear me talk about Jesus when I'm not doing it to try to coerce them into or threaten them into conversion, but first because they've seen Jesus used as a weapon and a cudgel and a threat for so long that they're sort of relieved to hear, oh wow, there are really some great things about Jesus. They have every reason to be suspicious. But but so we have to be able to share our stories, but then welcome their stories and tell me the stories from your tradition. I'm thinking about a dear friend of mine who's of the Sikh faith, and the stories of the Sikh tradition in the struggle for peace are just beautiful and mind-boggling and uh, and inspiring, right? And and so we each share our different stories. We might come to the point where we Christians start telling Buddhist and Sikh and Hindu and Muslim stories that we've learned from our friends, not appropriating them to legitimize our way, but in a certain way to point to this shared vision that we know has to emerge among us around the world. Um, let me say one other thing. I, we're going to have the tough job of maintaining stories that don't seem religious at all, but that an authoritarian regime tries to suppress.
Mm.
Uh, and I say that as a guy living in Florida, where, you know, you may have heard, but some churches in Florida are creating libraries of banned books, you know, and they advertise they won't let kids read these books or borrow these books from the school library, but we're going to make sure they're available here. Um, and and then so much education about the history of American racism is being suppressed in the schools. And there are churches that are developing and having places to teach about American history. And it just sounds funny to say that. They're still able to do it. Might people will try to oppress that they'll try to suppress it, but then people will find ways to keep telling those true stories too. Um, there's one other thing I want to say with nuance. I think we have to tell every good story we can of kindness among human beings that are happening, all the stories of peace. But we don't tell those stories to tell people, oh, things aren't so bad. You know what I mean? There's a certain way to tell encouraging stories to make people feel like you can return to your previously scheduled complacency. Everything is going to be okay. No, but there are ways to say, don't give up hope. I saw this happen. Don't give up hope. I experienced this. I saw this on the street. Don't give up hope. Someone just told me what happened to them. And we keep those stories. And, you know, I think there's a real sense that we can say these are stories of the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus alive and at work in our world today. And we need to hear those stories uh, to the greatest degree. The worse things get, the more we need those stories of basic human goodness and kindness.
That was great, Catherine. Thank you, Brian. Just also moving and wonderful. And I love stories of the movements and nonviolence. Yesterday, Brian, I did a podcast with Matthew Fox. I'm sure you know
Yes.
him.
I love Matthew. Yeah.
Yeah, and he launched into the story of Rosa Strasse.
Mm.
Do you know that story,
I
Brian?
don't know.
Right. 1943, 6,000 Jews from Germany survived the frontline war with Russia, were brought back to Berlin, were held in the former Jewish Community Center around the corner from Hitler's headquarters, and were being prepared to be shipped to Auschwitz. And their wives, 6,000 women, filled the street and did a sit-in and shut down the center of Berlin in 1943. And
Wow.
Hitler said, "No, there's no way I'm taking on these women."
Mm,
And the Jewish men were all released.
mm, mm,
And he was saying there's always hope in the power of nonviolence, and we have to keep these stories alive. I So this is what we're all trying to do, especially with the great story of Jesus. Now, there's a question, I think it's from Judith's iPad, but I don't think you look like Judith, you there on the Judith iPad. So why don't you unmute yourself and you can share your question for Brian? Whoever you are there on Judith's iPad about oppressing an oppressor. I don't know your name. Uh,
You need to unmute. He hasn't
yeah, you
unmuted.
need to unmute yourself.
Keep doing it. I
Yeah,
didn't get
that's you we're talking about with the yellow wall behind you and the two pictures in the black shirt.
yeah, I think he's working on it. He
He
can't do
can't
it.
do it. Okay, I'll read
I
to you
can't
his
do it for
question,
him.
Brian.
Yeah.
The gentleman says, "Thank you. I'm hoping you can say something about the psychological trauma inflicted by authoritarianism on both the oppressed and the oppressors."
Yeah.
So how does Jesus's nonviolence that we're trying to emulate function to heal both sides of the traumatization?
Yeah. Well, first, sometimes the question is more important than anything I could say in an answer, right? Just to remind us that there is a traumatizing effect, a dehumanizing effect of the authoritarian leader and those in power and those who are being oppressed. By the way, I have a feeling this is what Paul meant in Romans, in the epistle to the Romans, when he says that all creation is groaning for the revelation of the children of God, that that this dehumanization, that the world has never seen what human beings really can be. Um, and this revelation of human beings growing up and becoming what we really could be, it will require the redemption of the oppressor as well as the restoration of what has been taken from the oppressed. And this becomes one of the challenges of redemptive communities. You know, it's why the stories of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of South Africa and the parallel reconciliation movements in Rwanda after the genocide there. Um, we need these stories where there was a way for the oppressor and the oppressed to come to a place of peace, to come to a common ground of peace, where there was acknowledgement of the wrongs and and I think we go to the word forgiveness often very, very cheaply. But and then people react to forgiveness and think that it's all cheap. You know, the person who I think helped me, even though, you know, I've been a Christian and I was a pastor for so many years, um, but a woman named Eve Ensler, who now goes by the name V. She's well known. She wrote the Vagina Monologues, phenomenal writer, and but she late in life came out with a story of the horrible trauma that her father inflicted upon her, the abuse her father inflicted upon her as a child. And she wrote about this. There's a phenomenal TED talk about it. If you're interested, you could find this. And then she wrote a book called The Apology. And what she basically did in the book is she said, my father never apologized. So I wrote the apology I wish I would have received from him. And in the process of going through that, I feel like she came to terms with the steps of a really good apology. And I, it's worth you're looking into, but I'll just say one of the steps of the apology is first for the person who's done the wrong to acknowledge the wrong. But then she adds something that I'd never heard anyone talk about before, where the person who's done the wrong offers an explanation about how they became the kind of person that would do such a thing. Not as an excuse, but as a way of showing they're doing their inner work, of not just trying to get their wrongdoing sort of brushed aside, but they've been grappling with themselves, doing their inner work. How did I become a kind of person who would do that sort of thing? And you know, that's something for an individual that's a big deal, that's very significant. But don't you all feel this is what we've never done in our country? Our country has never said, how did we become the kind of country that unleashed the history that we've unleashed? Unless we think that authoritarianism is something new in the last couple of presidential administrations, let's remember it you can only enslave people through authoritarianism. Only authoritarians would enslave other human beings. So our whole history, only authoritarians would engage in genocide. So the authoritarian strain of our own history stream, it runs deep. And maybe one of the things that will come out of this current round of authoritarianism, where so much of our history is being hidden, maybe this will force the rest of us to do our work of saying, we're going to try to tell the story of our history and say, how did we become a kind of people who did those things? That might lead to a deeper reckoning. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Brian. So Shirley has a question about the religious leaders in Jesus' time, and I think we've got to ask you to reflect on them. Um, and I don't know what it is about going into organized religion and getting caught up in power and patriarchy and domination, and the next thing you know, even with the best intentions in whatever religion, power and religion just lead to authoritarianism. Here she writes, Jesus did point to the religious leaders as the ones to mislead people then and now. He called them the learned and the clever, but his message was very simple. We make it all very difficult. So maybe any thoughts about how Jesus is non-violently non-cooperated or resisted the religious leaders or tried to instruct them, and what it means for us now dealing with, you talk about all the Christian leaders in our country right now, Protestant and Catholic,
Yeah.
is becoming authoritarians. And it's a real serious question.
Yeah.
And I think the answer is moving towards engaging them because Jesus seemed to engage them,
Yeah.
but I may be wrong. And I think a lot of us just get angry and walk away from them. But maybe, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we should come back tomorrow. Give me 24
I'm
hours to
making
think
you
about
wipe
that.
your head. Is it
Well,
that
no,
bad?
it's such a good question. It's such a good question. Um, so let me say about Jesus' engagement with the religious leaders of his day. Uh, he does not walk on eggshells,
Mm-mm.
and that, uh,
What do you mean by
that's
that?
um, blind leaders of the blind, den of vipers,
Mm,
whitewashed tombs.
mm,
He uses the strongest language he can find. Um, and he doesn't attack them as individuals, he attacks them as a group, which I think is significant because he understands they're part of a system. And so when in the fourth gospel, when one of their number, Nicodemus, sneaks in at night to see him because, he didn't want to be seen during the day, Jesus receives him as a human being. Recalling our question the other day, he doesn't say, "You're forever my enemy." He he welcomes him and is willing to see him. So, and treat him like any other person. But Jesus doesn't walk on eggshells. He names things for what they are. And if we were to try to do that for our religious leaders today, I think one of the things we would do is what Dorothy Day did. When Dorothy Day talked about the filthy, rotten system, a lot of people think she was referring to capitalism, and I think she was indirectly. But what she was really dealing with was the power of money in religious institutions, and she was speaking specifically of the Catholic Church. But it's true in all of our religious settings. The filthy, rotten system that results when religion becomes has this unhealthy relationship with money. The problem, I was a pastor for 24 years. I I am not unrealistic about the need for money, right, in churches, but the power of money in religious institutions is something we're going to have to tell the truth about. The same donors that make deals with authoritarian leaders in transactional for you, I'll do this for you, you do that for me. The same donors are donating to religious institutions with the same transactional mentality. And it's something we don't talk about nearly enough. But whatever is going to happen to the church, if we don't address that, if we don't come up with a financial model where the power of donors to uh, control the message and the actions of the church, if we don't deal with that, we're not going to get where we need to be. So,
It's so great, Brian. I'm glad you mentioned Dorothy Day. Dan Berrigan used to tell me all the time that he heard her say many times, the only thing we can do, and always need to do in the church is stay small and stay poor. And that was kind of her slogan, which hasn't really gotten a lot of traction, but I think it's a kind of an anti-authoritarianism path. I can't figure out religious leaders, and I've tried some of that creative, nonviolent language of Jesus. It doesn't go over that well.
Yeah.
People don't like it when you tell, I told this Jesuit president of Georgetown, well, you're not very far from the kingdom of God. But that means you're not in the kingdom of God until you get rid of ROTC. You are against the kingdom of God. That
Yeah.
did not go over well, and he moved to have me dismissed. And is that nonviolent language? And so, Brian, what do you think about the language of Jesus? Because you brought it up, and I
Yeah.
didn't know you were going to bring it up. And I think Jesus tried every type of language.
Yes.
So he goes in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, here's what you do. You love your enemies.
Yeah.
You're poor, and you're merciful, and you're compassionate. And that doesn't work. So then he tries
Yeah.
parables. And then what? He sighs, and
Yeah.
then he's kind of insulting to the religious leaders, and then
Yeah.
finally he's silent before Pilate.
Yeah.
I think there are all types of nonviolent communication against authoritarianism,
Yes.
and
That's well said.
they're creative,
Yeah.
and but he's not afraid to speak.
Yeah.
And Matthew Fox said that Heschel's definition of a prophet in the Latin and the Greek, the Hebrew, a prophet is one who interferes. I didn't know that. And so, what do you think about that? The language in response
Yeah.
to Trump. And, we're all dealing with that in our families, our churches, our friends, our neighbors. It's like we're living in a zombie movie,
Yeah.
and I don't want to be judgmental, but on the other hand, I want to deal with. You also want to
Yeah.
care for people and lead them out of this insanity.
Yeah. 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 Uh, maybe I could offer this. First of all, I don't think there's an easy solution to this. And I'm really glad, John, that you talked about how Jesus had many different rhetorical strategies in different settings. It wasn't a one size fits all thing. But this might be helpful to all of us who are trying to figure out how to communicate in this time. And again, I could be wrong, but based on my years of life and this research on authoritarianism that has crystallized some things for me. First thing I'd say is we need to understand that people who have joined the authoritarian movement, if they are nice to us, they are being disloyal to the movement. If they see us as people who've not joined the movement and they're nice to us, they're already on thin ice. Because authoritarianism works by creating an us and a them, and anyone who's not part of us is part of them. And so if we expect, like, I think a whole lot of more progressive people, for example, are thinking we just need to have civil discourse. We just need to have conversations. But I think we're being a little naive in that you don't understand. If another person gives respect to your thought, they're being disloyal to the authoritarian leader who's demanded authority with threats if they don't stay loyal. So to be open to opposing ideas is to be disloyal to the leader who does your thinking for you, right? So if we could understand that from the start, what I think we have to do, this maybe is part of what Jesus meant by be wise as serpents, innocent as doves. Innocent as doves is interesting. What is wise as serpents? Well, one thing serpents can do is they can get through a tiny hole, you know, and so maybe first of all, acts of kindness, human kindness, communicate a refusal to write people off, a refusal to consider a person as beyond redemption. But here's what I found in my interactions with people, because I'm outspoken, as I'm sure many of us are. I certainly get my share of pushback and ridicule and so on. But when I find people who are open or who say something in my presence that I think is harmful and wrong and so on, I will just say, I'll just interrupt. Sometimes you have to literally put up your hand. Have to do something to interrupt. And I'll say, listen, I want you to know I see that differently. In fact, my little 5 words, wow, I see that differently. And what I'm doing at that moment is I'm intervening and saying, you need to know that I don't go along with what you're saying now. But I don't say you're an idiot, you're a bigot, you're a fool. Wow, I see that differently. Then almost always people will say, well, what do you mean? And at that point, if I'm in public and there's a group of people, here's what I'm aware of. The other person will be performing for the other people in who are present. Um, if other people are in the authoritarian team, they will not be trying to communicate with me. They will be performing their loyalty to the regime. And so we're not going to have an honest conversation in a setting like that. So, what I might say is if you really want to know how I see things, if you're really, really curious, ask me in private. I'll be glad to talk to you in private. And all of you here too, I might say, if other people are around. Uh, um, and I've done some writing about this. If you're interested in seeing my writing, if you're really interested in what I think, here, I would love to talk to you about it. What that does is it changes the setting from a public setting that's going to be him performing or her performing their loyalty and me performing my resistance, which ends up ego versus ego and doesn't usually end up with heart to heart communication. Um, I think there's a time for that, but it doesn't tend to lead to breakthroughs. So then I'll say, in fact, it's like saying, be like Nicodemus, come to me in private and we can have an honest conversation. Yeah. And so that's what I found, human kindness, create opportunities for private conversation, and always let them know if you ever want to talk about this, I'm happy to talk. Keep the communication lines open. That's sometimes the best we can do in an authoritarian time. Uh, and part of what we're waking up to is we're in the midst of an authoritarian takeover that may or may not consolidate. Um, and we're in the middle of that, and we're part of it, and we have no guarantees what the outcome will be. So,
Well, Brian, gosh, we could go on and on. There's so much to talk about, but this was so insightful and powerful and helpful. And I just, it's the time is up. So I'll say on behalf of everybody, let's show Brian a big warm round of applause and thank you for your wisdom and your insight. And it's just kind of refreshing and shocking to hear someone just talk so clearly about authoritarianism, and then Jesus totally the opposite of that. Very helpful. And maybe we can all go and give Brian's talk to all our friends and colleagues, and that's one step, and continuing to reflect on it. Before we sign off, I want to just a few commercial announcements here. So the next Zoom program is with Elizabeth Johnson, who's another great theologian in the world, and she'll be with us on Saturday, June 7th, talking about God. God as universal love, universal compassion, universal peace. And I said, that's what I need to hear, so I need you to talk to us about that, Beth. And she says, oh, well, then that means we have to get over this business of sacrifice, that God needed the blood of Jesus to deal with everything. And of course, right there, I get confused. And so she's going to explain everything to us. And this is very helpful. In July, our mutual friend Larry Rasmussen will continue on Brian's themes on Saturday, July 5th, and talk about Bonhoeffer's essay on organized stupidity as his analysis of the rise of the Third Reich, written in the late 1930s. And now Larry is one of the leading and first environmental theologians, but he's also an expert on Bonhoeffer. And I have mixed feelings on Bonhoeffer, but what a great man, and wow, he struggled. And he went deeper than anybody up till perhaps now in a Christian response to authoritarianism. And he called it organized stupidity. So I've asked Larry to talk to us about that. And then, well, there's others coming up after that. Wes Howard Brooke will be here in August. He wrote a 1,000-page book. I don't know if you ever read it, Brian. Come Out of My People, Come Out of Empire. A whole book on the Bible, the entire Bible in one book as one theme, God calling humanity out of empire and authoritarianism. It's incredible. And I think it's brilliant. And so Wes is going to be here to talk about that. I'm doing many podcasts every week. They're all free. The Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I hope you can tell the word, spread the word about it to everybody. They're really good. I have many great guests, and you can listen to all the old ones like Brian at the beatitudecenter.org. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and blessings of peace to everybody. And let's go and keep following Jesus and live out these beautiful teachings that Brian has shared with us. Those who'd like to stay on, you're welcome to. I'll stay on, but we'll say goodbye to Brian. And I'll see you next time, okay, Brian? Go have a beer or a cup of coffee and relax. You've done good. And take care. And God bless everybody. So signing off with the recording now.